Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to look up at the stars or down into the depths of the ocean. Tonight, we are going somewhere smaller and somehow just as vast, a single village, cupped in the hills of old Japan in the hour just before a storm arrives. It is a place built entirely from patience, from rice and water, from wood and paper and smoke, from centuries of people learning to live gently alongside a sky that could not always be trusted. A village like this is not just a place. It is a rhythm worn smooth by generations, still humming quietly under the surface of the modern world. If you have had a long day, and I suspect you have, since most days are long in their own way, you don't need cosmic mysteries tonight or big ideas to wrestle with. You just need somewhere to rest your attention until it loosens its grip entirely. That's all this is for. So we'll wander gently through this village, its rooftops and rice paddies, its lanterns and quiet doorways, at the unhurried pace of someone with nowhere else to be. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, either. And if these gentle journeys ever help you drift off, a quiet like from you helps other sleepy souls find their way here too. But that's just a small thought for later. For now, there is only this. Let's begin by letting your body soften. Wherever you are lying right now, let it hold all of your weight. You don't have to help it. Let your shoulders drop a little further from your ears than they were a moment ago. Let your jaw loosen, just slightly, the little muscles at the hinge of it, unclenching without needing to be told twice. Let your breathing slow down, not by forcing it, but simply by noticing it, the way you might notice rain starting outside a window. In and out, a little slower each time. You don't need to remember anything I say tonight. You don't need to follow every thread. Nothing here is a test, and there is no version of tonight where you do this wrong. If your mind drifts away entirely and comes back 20 minutes later, that's not a failure. That's just what falling asleep actually looks like from the inside. So let your mind drift, loose as a paper lantern on a still pond, as we begin to wander. Some villages were never built. They grew. Long before there were samurai patrolling the roads or lords collecting rice as tax, there were simply people who noticed where the water pooled gently after rain, where the hillside caught the morning sun, where the soil held moisture without drowning. A village would begin as one or two households near a bend in a stream, and over generations, without any single decision, it would thicken into lanes and terraces and shared wells. Nobody drew a plan for it. It simply accumulated, the way a riverbed accumulates smooth stones, each one placed by nothing more than time, and water finding the path of least resistance. Think of your own life this way for a moment. You didn't plan every turn that brought you to where you are tonight. Somewhere in there, like the quiet founders of that village, you simply followed what felt survivable, one small decision at a time, until a whole life had grown up around you without a blueprint. But that is only one small part of the story. The roofs of these villages were made of rice straw, layered by hand, sometimes a foot thick, and they could last for decades if the weather was kind to them. Picture it not as a modern roof, hard and flat, but as something closer to a haystack shaped with extraordinary patience. Bundled straw laid in overlapping rows, angled steeply so rain would run off before it had time to seep in. A single roof might use the stalks from an entire year's harvest, meaning the roof over a family's heads was, quite literally, last year's food, repurposed to keep this year's family dry. There is something tender in that. The same plant that filled their bowls also sheltered their sleep. Nothing wasted, everything folded back into use. The way your own body tonight is made from meals you no longer remember eating. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long before anyone had instruments to measure pressure or wind, villagers had already learned to read the sky the way you might read a familiar face. A sudden hush in the birdsong, swallows flying low, hugging the ground instead of circling high, the smell of wet soil arriving on the wind before a single drop had fallen. These were not superstitions so much as compressed generations of quiet observation, passed from grandparent to grandchild as small warnings folded into ordinary conversation, mentioned so casually you might not even notice you were being taught. Your own body still does something like this, in its own hush before sleep. The heaviness in your eyelids right now, the softening in your chest, these are not random. They are your body reading its own weather quietly, without needing your permission. But that is only one small part of the story. In many of these villages, a single bell marked the turning of the day, hung in a small wooden tower, or kept in the modest hall of the local temple. It didn't ring often, perhaps at dawn, perhaps at dusk, perhaps to mark a festival or a warning, but its sound would roll out over the rice fields and settle into the wood of every house, low and round, the kind of sound that seems to arrive from everywhere and nowhere at once. People didn't check the bell the way you check a clock. They simply lived inside its rhythm, the way you live inside your own heartbeat without ever really listening for it. Somewhere in your chest right now, something similar is quietly ringing, a slow rhythm you've never once had to remember to keep going. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. At the center of the hearth, in almost every home, sat a small sunken pit called an orari, where a low fire burned nearly all day and night. It was where meals were cooked, where wet clothes were dried, where children fell asleep leaning against a parent's side, while the adults talked quietly above their heads. The smoke would curl slowly upward, finding its way out through gaps in the roof, leaving the beams above blackened and faintly fragrant after years of gentle burning. This single fire was, in a very real sense, the beating center of the whole household, never roaring, never forgotten, simply tended. Your own body has something like that fire in it tonight, a low, steady warmth that doesn't need watching to keep going, quietly tended by nothing more than your own breathing. But that is only one small part of the story. Bamboo groves surrounded many of these villages, and they made a sound unlike almost anything else in nature. When wind moved through a bamboo forest, the tall stalks would knock gently against each other. A hollow, wooden clicking, softer than you'd expect, layered underneath a constant papery rustle of leaves far overhead. Villagers used this sound almost like a second kind of weather report. A bamboo grove restless, and clattering meant wind was rising, while a grove gone strangely still could mean something was about to change. There's a kind of stillness in a room just like that, the quiet right before something shifts, the held breath before sleep finally arrives. You might be closer to that stillness right now than you realize. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Rain gear in these villages wasn't fabric at all, but straw woven into capes called mino that made the wearer look, from a distance, almost like a walking haystack. A farmer caught in a sudden downpour would simply shrug on this straw cape and keep working, the water sliding off each layered strand the same way it slid off the thatched roofs above. It wasn't elegant. It was simply clever, using the same humble material, arranged the same clever way, to solve the same old problem of staying dry in a world that didn't care whether you got wet. Notice, if you like, the blanket or sheet resting over you right now, another simple layer, arranged the same clever way generations of humans have always arranged their coverings, quietly keeping the weather of the night outside where it belongs. But that is only one small part of the story. Thunder, in the old stories that circulated through these villages, wasn't just noise. It was a god named Rajan, often pictured surrounded by drums, striking them to make the sky rumble. Children were told, half seriously, to cover their bellies during a storm, since Rajan was said to enjoy stealing navels from careless little ones caught outside. It sounds strange now, almost playful, but underneath, the folklore was something gentler, a way of making an enormous, uncontrollable force feel a little more familiar, a little more like a character in a story rather than a blind and indifferent sky. Even now, giving a shape to something big and formless, a worry, a fear, the noise in your own mind, can make it easier to set down for the night. The way Rajan's drums made thunder into something almost like company. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Village wells were often the true center of daily life, far more than any market or shrine. Twice a day, sometimes more, women and children would walk to the well with wooden buckets balanced on shoulder poles. And in those minutes of waiting and drawing water, news moved through the village faster than any messenger could carry it. A birth in one household, an illness in another, the ripening of someone's plums, all of it passed hand to hand at the edge of that quiet stone circle, along with the water itself. Think of this as an old, slow version of the small exchanges that still stitch your own days together. The brief hellos, the little updates. The water carried quietly from one person to the next. But that is only one small part of the story. Rice was so central to these villages that for centuries it wasn't just food. It was currency, taxation, and measurement of worth all at once. A feudal lord's wealth was counted in koku, a unit describing roughly how much rice was needed to feed one person for a year. An entire domain's power could be summarized in a single number, standing in for thousands of individual harvests, thousands of individual meals eaten by thousands of individual families whose names were never recorded anywhere. There is something quietly moving in that, how something as ordinary as a bowl of rice, repeated humbly and endlessly, could become the very unit by which an entire world measured its own worth. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Silk was cultivated in many of these farming villages too, though it required a strange kind of patience most modern lives no longer make room for. Silkworms were raised indoors on trays of mulberry leaves, and the entire household would sometimes reorganize its rhythm around their feeding. Quiet, near silent hours spent listening to the soft, continuous sound of thousands of tiny mouths chewing leaves in the dark. From that unglamorous, patient labor eventually came threads fine enough to weave into some of the most prized fabric in the world. Something soft and valuable is often built this way, not in a single dramatic moment, but in thousands of small, unremarkable repetitions, the same way each slow breath you're taking right now is quietly weaving you toward sleep. But that is only one small part of the story. Paper in these villages wasn't bought from a shop. It was made, sheet by sheet, from the fibrous inner bark of the mulberry tree, in a process called washi. The bark would be soaked, boiled, beaten into pulp, then lifted in thin, even layers on a bamboo screen, and left to dry in the open air. The resulting paper was strong enough to be used for windows, for umbrellas, for the sliding doors that separated one quiet room from another, translucent enough to soften sunlight into something gentler before it ever reached the people inside. Even light, in a village like this, was gently filtered before it reached anyone. Softened, the way your own thoughts are softening right now on their way toward whatever comes next. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Fireflies would rise from the rice paddies on warm summer evenings in numbers that are difficult to picture today. Small green-gold lights blinking low over the water like scattered, drifting stars. Children would catch them gently in cupped hands or thin cages woven from grass, releasing them again before bed. And for a few weeks each year, the entire village seemed to glow faintly after dark, as though the sky and the fields had quietly traded places. You don't need to picture anything sharply right now. Just let that image blur softly at the edges, a field of small lights, drifting, dimming one by one, the way your own thoughts might be dimming right now. But that is only one small part of the story. Cicadas, in the height of summer, produced a sound so constant and so loud that it became less like noise and more like silence's opposite twin. Different species would take turns through the day, one handing the sound to the next almost seamlessly, so the drone never quite stopped from dawn until dusk. Villagers grew so accustomed to it that visitors were often the only ones who noticed it at all, proof that even overwhelming sound can become simply part of the background once you've lived inside it long enough. Whatever sounds are around you right now, distant traffic, a fan, the hush of your own room, notice how quickly they too can fade into simple background, no longer needing your attention at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Before a storm specifically, villagers noticed something odd about their animals, dogs pacing restlessly, cats seeking hidden corners, chickens growing quiet and still on their roosts long before any thunder could be heard. We now understand this partly through changes in air pressure, which animals can sense far more keenly than humans, along with shifts in electrical charge in the air itself. But long before anyone had that explanation, villagers simply trusted the animal's behavior as its own kind of forecast, more reliable in some ways than watching the clouds. There may be something in your own body doing something similar right now. Some quiet, wordless part of you sensing that rest is close, long before your thinking mind has caught up to agree. But that is only one small part of the story. Terraced rice paddies, cut into hillsides in wide curving steps, were not just farmland. They were an enormous, slow act of water management. Each terrace was leveled with extraordinary precision, so water would pool evenly, then spill gently down to the terrace below rather than rushing and eroding the slope. Some of these terrace systems, built by hand over generations with no machinery at all, are still standing today, still holding water exactly the way they were designed to, centuries after the last hands that shaped them have gone still. There is a kind of trust in building something meant to outlast you completely. Tonight, in a much smaller way, you are doing something similar, trusting that rest built now will still be holding you tomorrow. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Village scarecrows, called Kakashi, were often far stranger and more elaborate than the simple straw figures you might picture. Some were dressed in old, worn clothing donated by villagers, given hats, even given faces painted with rough, friendly expressions, standing sentinel over the rice through entire growing seasons, weathering sun and rain and wind without complaint. Children sometimes named them, half joking, half affectionate, as though the fields had their own quiet, patient guardian keeping watch while everyone else slept. Think of something in your own life, standing quiet watch tonight, a lock on a door, a nightlight down the hall, simply the walls around you, allowing you to let your guard down completely. But that is only one small part of the story. Moon viewing, called tsukimi, was an entire seasonal tradition built around doing almost nothing at all except looking up. Families would gather on a platform or porch in autumn, when the moon was said to be at its clearest, sharing rice dumplings and warm drinks while doing nothing more ambitious than watching the sky slowly change color as the moon climbed higher. There was no goal to it, no lesson to extract, simply an agreed, shared permission to stop and notice something beautiful and untouchable happening far overhead. You don't need a reason to rest tonight either. No lesson to extract, no goal to reach. Just permission quietly given to stop. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The wooden sandals many villagers wore, called geta, made a very particular sound against stone or packed earth paths. A light, hollow clack, 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 rhythmic and unmistakable. You could often tell who was approaching a house before you ever saw them, simply by the particular rhythm and weight of their footsteps on wood. It was, in its own small way, a kind of signature, a sound as personal and recognizable as a voice, carried not through the throat, but through the soles of the feet. There's a rhythm like that in your own breathing right now, slower and slower. A signature only you carry, nobody else breathing quite like you, quite this slowly, quite this close to sleep. But that is only one small part of the story. Tatami mats, woven from rush grass over a firm straw core, gave these homes both their measurement and their scent. Room sizes were often described not in feet or meters, but simply in tatami, a 6-mat room, an 8-mat room, the mats themselves setting the very shape of daily life. And in the humid months especially, they released a faint, grassy, almost sweet smell that clung quietly to clothing and hair, a smell so ordinary to those who lived among it that it likely went almost entirely unnoticed. Whatever quiet, ordinary smell surrounds you right now, fabric, skin, the air of your own room, let it become just as unnoticed, just as safely ordinary, as you drift further from needing to notice anything at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. At night, in most of these homes, The futon wasn't a fixed piece of furniture at all, but something folded away each morning and unrolled again each evening, transforming the very same room from a place of work into a place of rest. This meant sleep was never separated into its own permanent room, the way it often is now, but was folded into every space, ready to be summoned the moment the day's business had finally, fully ended. There was something practical in it, but also something quietly wise, a reminder, repeated nightly, that any space can become a place of rest once the day's work has been folded away. Wherever you are lying right now has become exactly that kind of space. The day's work, wherever it went, can be folded away now too. But that is only one small part of the story. Wooden pillows, called makura, were sometimes used instead of soft cushions, particularly by those who needed to protect elaborate hairstyles overnight. They look uncomfortable to modern eyes, but they were carefully shaped to cradle the neck rather than the whole head, allowing hair arranged carefully that morning to remain untouched by dawn. It's a strange, specific kind of devotion, accepting a harder night's rest in exchange for preserving something delicate and deliberately made. You don't need to accept any hardness tonight. Whatever is beneath your head right now can simply hold you, softly, exactly as it is. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Household shrines, small and modest, sat quietly in a corner of many homes, honoring ancestors who were spoken of, even generations later, as though they were simply in another room. A small offering of rice or water, a quiet word spoken at the start or end of a day. These were not dramatic rituals, but small, steady threads keeping the living gently connected to those who came before them. In this way, no one in the household was ever entirely alone. The past sat quietly nearby, neither forgotten nor demanding, simply present. Whoever has cared for you across your own life, however far away, however long gone, some quiet thread like that likely still connects you to them tonight, whether you've thought of it in years or not. But that is only one small part of the story. Village dogs weren't kept for show. They were early warning systems, guardians of grain stores, companions on long walks between fields. A dog's bark carrying across the rice paddies at an unusual hour, too early, too insistent, could mean a wild boar in the fields, or a stranger on the road, or simply a storm's first faraway rumble. Villagers learned, over time, to distinguish one kind of bark from another almost the way you distinguish two different voices, each carrying its own particular meaning. Somewhere in your own life, perhaps, there's a sound you'd recognize instantly, even from sleep. And knowing that sound is not tonight's sound can be its own small permission to rest without listening quite so hard. there is something else worth resting on for a moment. Storms, when they truly arrived, were often preceded by a very particular kind of light, a strange yellow-green tint to the sky, sometimes called storm light, caused by sunlight scattering differently through storm-laden air. Villagers came to recognize this light almost instinctively, a signal more reliable than any single cloud shape. And upon seeing it, they would move without panic, but without delay, either securing shutters, calling children in from the fields, banking the hearth fire a little higher against the coming damp. There's no storm light needed tonight, no signal to watch for. You've already done everything that needs doing. There is nothing left to secure, nothing left to call in from anywhere. But that is only one small part of the story. Lanterns, called chachin, made of paper stretched over a collapsible bamboo frame, provided nearly all the light a village had after sunset. A single candle inside would cast a warm, uneven glow through the paper, dim by modern standards, but deeply sufficient for a world that had never known anything brighter. Carried along a dark path home, a lantern's small circle of light didn't banish the darkness so much as simply walk alongside it, the two of them traveling together without either one needing to win. The dimness settling over your own thoughts right now doesn't need to be banished either. It can simply walk alongside you for a while, the way that lantern light always did. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Fish traps, woven from bamboo, and set into the shallow bends of village streams, worked on a principle so simple it barely needed explaining. Fish could swim in easily, but the narrowing funnel shape made swimming back out nearly impossible. Children were often given the job of checking these traps at dawn, wading into cold, clear water before the day's heat arrived, pulling up whatever the stream had quietly gathered overnight. It was one of the gentlest forms of labor a village had, more like a morning ritual than actual work. Whatever your mind has been quietly gathering today, worries, small tasks, half-finished thoughts, you can leave all of it exactly where it is until morning. The way a trap is simply left in the water overnight, unwatched, untended, entirely fine on its own. But that is only one small part of the story. Cherry blossoms, blooming for barely a week or two each spring before scattering entirely, were treasured precisely because of how briefly they lasted. Villagers would gather beneath blooming trees for hanami, cherry blossom viewing, understanding without needing to say it aloud that the beauty mattered more, not less, because it wouldn't last. There is a particular kind of comfort in things that are allowed to be temporary, a permission to simply enjoy something fully without needing it to stay forever in order to have mattered. Tonight, too, doesn't need to last forever to matter. This one stretch of rest, however long it turns out to be, is allowed to simply be exactly what it is. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Mist over the rice paddies at dawn was so common in certain valleys that it became part of the very identity of a place, thick, low, drifting silently over still water before the sun burned it away. Farmers walking out at first light would move through it, as though wading through something soft and half real, their lower bodies disappearing into white, while their heads and shoulders remained clear above it, the whole scene looking, to any outsider, faintly like a dream someone had simply stepped into. You don't need to hold onto the shape of anything right now. Let the edges of your thoughts go soft and half real too, the way that morning mist always did before it quietly lifted on its own. But that is only one small part of the story. Thatched roofs required regular rethatching, and this work was almost never done by a single family alone. It was communal, an entire village turning out to help relay the roof of whichever household needed it that season. In exchange, that family would help with someone else's roof the following year, and the year after that, so that over decades, every roof in the village had, in some quiet way, been touched by nearly every set of hands living there. No roof stood entirely on its own effort. Every shelter was, in the end, a shared one. Whatever is sheltering you tonight, walls, blankets, simply the quiet of the room, some part of it too, likely traces back to hands other than your own, quietly helping build the life that lets you rest right now. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Lightning, though feared, was also understood by many farming villages as something quietly generous. A belief that lightning striking a field could make that year's rice crop unusually abundant. We now know there's a thread of real chemistry behind that old belief. Lightning can convert nitrogen in the air into a form plants can absorb, effectively fertilizing the soil it strikes. So an old superstition, dismissed for centuries as simple folklore, turns out to describe something the earth was quietly doing the entire time. Sometimes what looks frightening from the outside is doing something useful and unseen underneath. The heaviness settling over you right now, however unfamiliar it feels, is doing exactly that quietly useful, entirely unseen. But that is only one small part of the story. Village boundaries were often marked not by fences, but by small stone or wooden markers dedicated to local kami, protective spirits believed to watch over a particular grove, well, or crossing. Travelers passing one of these markers might offer a small bow or a quiet word, not out of fear exactly, but out of a kind of ordinary respect. The sense that this patch of land, like every patch of land, belonged to something a little larger than any single person passing through it. Wherever you are lying right now belongs, in its own quiet way, to something larger too. A room, a home, a night sky outside that has been turning long before you arrived, and will keep turning long after you've fallen fully asleep. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Storm shutters, called amado, slid along wooden tracks to fully enclose a house before a typhoon or heavy storm, turning open airy rooms into something closer to a sealed wooden box. Families would slide these shutters closed one by one along the veranda, moving in practiced, wordless order, and inside, the house would grow dim and close and safe, the storm's noise dulled to a distant hush against solid wood. There was comfort in that particular kind of darkness, not the darkness of danger, but the darkness of having already done everything necessary to be safe. You have already done everything necessary to be safe tonight too. The shutters, so to speak, are already closed. There is nothing left outside that can reach you now. But that is only one small part of the story. The mind, in truth, is something like a prediction machine, quietly guessing what will happen next based on everything it has ever learned, then comparing that guess to what actually occurs. All day, your mind has been doing exactly this, anticipating conversations, expecting certain outcomes, adjusting quietly when things went differently than predicted. That is, in part, why a long day feels tiring even when you haven't moved your body very much. The guessing itself takes real effort. This voice, low and steady and unhurried, is one small way of giving that machine less to predict, fewer surprises to prepare for, until it finally has permission to stop guessing altogether. Nothing here tonight is asking your mind to predict anything at all. It can simply stop guessing now. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Blacksmiths who forged swords rarely lived in the village itself, but in a small forge set apart, often near a stream, since water and fire needed to work together in careful balance for the steel to come out right. A single blade could take weeks to complete, folded and hammered dozens of times over. The smith listening as much as looking, judging the metal's readiness by the particular ring it made under the hammer. Children in the village grew up hearing that distant, rhythmic clanging carried faintly on the wind, a sound so constant it became simply part of the landscape, the way a heartbeat becomes part of a chest. There's a rhythm like that being folded quietly into you right now too, nothing dramatic, just steady, patient repetition, each breath folding you a little further toward rest. But that is only one small part of the story. Indigo dyeing was one of the few crafts almost entirely kept by women in these villages, using leaves fermented slowly in wooden vats until they produced a deep, near black blue. Cloth would be dipped again and again, pulled out pale, and oxidizing slowly in the air to a richer shade each time, so that a single piece of fabric might carry the memory of a dozen careful dips, a dozen small waits. The vats themselves needed to be tended daily, fed and stirred like something almost alive, kept at just the right warmth to keep the color willing to take hold. Whatever quiet has settled over you tonight has probably taken more than one small dip too, not sudden, but built slowly, layer over layer, until it finally deepened into something real. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Tea, in its earliest village form, was rarely the elaborate ceremony people picture today. It was simple, practical, brewed strong in a modest pot, and shared without much ritual at all after a day's labor in the fields. The quieter, more formal tea ceremony grew later in cities and temples, but its root idea was already present in every village kitchen. The simple act of pausing, of sharing something warm, of letting a small, ordinary moment stretch out a little longer than it strictly needed to. Even now, that root idea survives in nearly identical form, wherever two tired people sit together and let a warm drink slow them both down. You don't need tea to borrow that same pause tonight. Just the pause itself, however you've arrived at it, is enough. But that is only one small part of the story. Village herbalists, often older women with decades of quiet observation behind them, kept a working knowledge of which plants eased fever, which soothed a cough, which could calm a restless stomach. This knowledge was rarely written down in the earliest generations. It lived instead in memory, passed along through direct demonstration, a hand guiding a child's hand toward the right leaf among dozens of similar ones. A herbalist's reputation was built slowly, one small remedy at a time, until an entire village trusted her judgment the way you might trust a familiar voice in the dark. There is a kind of old, wordless knowledge like that already living in your own body tonight. No instructions needed, no memory required, just a quiet trust that it knows exactly how to bring you toward sleep. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Salt, essential for both cooking and preserving food through the long winter months, was made along the coast by evaporating seawater in shallow pans under the sun, then boiling down what remained. It was slow, patient work, repeated daily through the warmer months, the salt gradually accumulating in small white drifts that were carefully gathered and carried inland to villages that had no coast of their own. A pinch of salt in a farmer's evening rice might have traveled, hand to hand, farther than that farmer ever traveled in his own life. Something small and simple, carried carefully a long way, can end up mattering enormously. Whatever quiet has traveled through your own day to arrive here tonight, however far it came, has done exactly that. But that is only one small part of the story. Charcoal makers worked deep in the forested hills above many villages, tending kilns that could smolder for days at a time, converting whole stacks of wood slowly into the dense, clean-burning fuel that would later warm 100 distant hearths. Their work was solitary and smoky, often lasting through entire nights, watching for the particular thin wisp of smoke that told them the wood inside was converting properly rather than simply burning away to nothing. It was one of the loneliest jobs in the whole village economy, and also one of the most quietly essential. Nobody's dinner would cook, nobody's room would stay warm without those long, unseen nights in the hills. Something is being quietly converted in you right now too, the rough material of today, slowly turning into something calmer, something that will simply glow steady and low until morning. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Rice wine, called sake, brewed in some villages in small batches, required patience nearly as demanding as any craft. Rice steamed, then seeded with a particular mold, then left to ferment slowly across weeks in cool cellars. Brewers judged its progress not by clocks, but by smell and sound, listening for a faint, steady bubbling that told them the fermentation was proceeding at the right pace, neither rushed nor stalled. A finished batch was often shared first with the household's small shrine, poured out as an offering before anyone else was allowed to taste it. Gratitude expressed before enjoyment, in that order, every time. Whatever rest arrives for you tonight is allowed to simply arrive in its own time too, at its own pace, needing nothing from you except the patience to let it finish becoming what it's already becoming. But that is only one small part of the story. Straw rope, twisted by hand from dried rice stalks, served dozens of purposes throughout a village, binding bundles, tying gates, and in its most sacred form, hung as shaimnawa around trees, stones, or shrine gates believed to house a kami. The twisting itself was almost meditative, done by firelight on long evenings, strand over strand in a steady rhythm that many villagers could perform half asleep, their hands remembering the motion long after their minds had wandered elsewhere. A well-made length of straw rope, sacred or ordinary, might last a full season before needing to be replaced. Your own hands, wherever they're resting right now, don't need to do anything either. They can simply rest, the way rope rests once its twisting is finally finished. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. River crossings, before bridges were common, often relied on a ferryman poling a flat wooden boat back and forth across the current, a job passed down within certain families for generations. Travelers would call out from the far bank, and the ferryman would appear, unhurried, guiding his boat through water he knew so intimately he could often navigate it by feel alone on the darkest nights, reading subtle changes in the current, the way you might read a familiar sentence. Villagers trusted this quiet, repetitive expertise completely, never once needing to understand it themselves. You don't need to understand how sleep works to trust it either. Something in you already knows this crossing by feel, the way that ferryman knew his river, guiding you gently toward the other side. But that is only one small part of the story. Mountain passes connecting one valley village to the next were often treacherous, narrow, and prone to sudden fog. So villages along popular routes maintained small rest stations, simple shelters with a fire always kept lit, ready for any traveler caught by weather or exhaustion. These shelters asked for nothing in return, no payment, no explanation, simply offering warmth to anyone who needed it before continuing on. A quiet kindness extended to strangers who would likely never be seen again. Travelers passing through years later would sometimes remember, more than anything else about the whole journey, that one small fire kept burning for no one in particular. Wherever you are right now can be exactly that kind of shelter tonight, asking nothing of you, simply here, simply warm, for as long as you need it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Natural hot springs, called onsen, tucked into certain mountainous regions near villages, offered something close to pure luxury in lives that otherwise held very little of it. After a long day of labor, villagers might walk together to a shared spring, easing into water heated by the earth itself, rather than any fire they tended. Muscles loosening in a way no ordinary bath at home could quite replicate. Conversation in these springs tended to be sparse, unhurried, mostly just quiet company shared in warm water beneath an open sky. Let whatever warmth is around you right now do something similar, not asking for conversation, not asking for anything at all, just easing whatever tightness the day left behind. But that is only one small part of the story. Tofu making was a quiet, early morning task in many villages. Soybeans soaked overnight, then ground, boiled, and coaxed into curds, using nothing more than mineral-rich water or a splash of vinegar. The process demanded patience and a light touch. Too much heat too fast, or too rough a hand, and the curds would separate poorly. The whole batch ruined before breakfast had even properly begun. Done correctly, though, the result was something impossibly soft, nearly weightless, that could still hold its own careful shape on a plate. You can hold your own shape just as gently tonight, soft, unhurried, needing no force at all to settle exactly where you're meant to be. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Miso, the fermented soybean paste used in nearly every household's daily soup, was often made just once a year, in large batches stored in wooden barrels that would sit quietly in a cool corner for months, sometimes years, slowly deepening in flavor. A family's miso barrel was almost a member of the household in its own right, tended and occasionally checked, but mostly simply left alone to do the slow, invisible work fermentation does best. Some barrels were passed down for generations, a portion of one year's paste always kept back to help start the next, an unbroken thread of flavor stretching further back than anyone could clearly remember. Something similar might be quietly working in you tonight, slow, invisible, needing nothing from you but time and a bit of undisturbed dark. But that is only one small part of the story. Traveling performers occasionally passed through even small, remote villages, bringing simple puppet shows or early forms of theater, setting up for a single evening in a clearing or temple courtyard before moving on. For villagers who rarely traveled far from their own fields, these brief performances were a kind of small window flung open onto a wider world. Other stories, other places, carried in on the backs of strangers who would be gone again by morning. Children especially would talk about a single evening's performance for weeks afterward, replaying favorite moments long after the performers themselves had disappeared down the road. Whatever small, good moment from your own day is still quietly replaying somewhere in the back of your mind. You can let it finish its last replay now and rest. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Autumn brought its own quiet tradition, momijigari, or maple leaf hunting. Not hunting in any literal sense, but simply walking out to view hillsides turned brilliant red and gold as the weather cooled. Families would pack a light meal and spend an afternoon doing very little besides sitting beneath color-changing trees, watching leaves occasionally let go and spiral down without any wind at all, seemingly of their own unhurried decision. There was no urgency in watching a leaf fall. It happened exactly when it happened, and everyone simply waited, unbothered, for it too. Whatever is ready to let go in you tonight can fall in exactly the same unhurried way. No wind required, no urgency, simply its own quiet decision whenever it's ready. But that is only one small part of the story. Fox spirits, called kitsune, appeared often in village folklore, sometimes mischievous, sometimes protective, said to be capable of taking human shape and walking unnoticed among ordinary villagers. A sudden, unexplained stroke of luck, or an oddly persistent trickster prank, might quietly be attributed to a fox spirit passing through. A way of giving shape and a small story to the parts of daily life that otherwise had no easy explanation. Shrines dedicated to these fox spirits, marked by small stone statues, could be found at the edges of many rice fields, quietly watched over, quietly left small offerings. Whatever unexplained heaviness or lightness has settled into your evening tonight doesn't need an explanation either. It can simply be the way a fox slipping through tall grass simply is, gone again before you fully noticed it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Village bathhouses, called sento, existed in slightly larger settlements, communal spaces where neighbors soaked together at the end of the day, sharing warmth and quiet conversation in place of any real privacy. The water was heated slowly over a wood fire tended by whoever ran the bathhouse, and the whole building would fill gradually with steam and low voices. An entire day's worth of separate small worries, somehow softening once bodies settled into the same warm water. Nobody rushed in a sento. Rushing wasn't really possible there, and nobody particularly wanted it to be. There's no rushing required of you either, right where you are. Just the same slow softening, the same low, undemanding warmth, doing exactly what it's always done for tired bodies at the end of a long day. But that is only one small part of the story. Kite flying wasn't only a children's pastime in these villages. Some kites grew enormous, requiring a dozen or more adults to launch and control, decorated with painted warriors or mythical creatures stretching many feet across. Villages sometimes competed gently against neighboring villages during festival season, kites tangling deliberately overhead in a rough, good-natured contest to see whose line would be the last to snap. The sky during these festivals would fill with color, dozens of kites rising and dipping at once, tethered to dozens of pairs of hands on the ground below, all of them looking upward together at exactly the same time. You don't need to look upward at anything right now. Whatever is tethering you gently to this moment, a blanket, a pillow, simple tiredness, is more than enough to hold you steady until morning. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Water wheels turned slowly along certain village streams, powering simple mills that ground rice or grain, their wooden paddles dipping and lifting in an endless, patient rotation that required no one to push it along. The sound of a working water wheel became, for those who lived nearby, less like machinery and more like weather, a low, constant creak and splash absorbed so completely into daily life that villagers claimed they could no longer fall asleep in houses without one nearby. The wheel never hurried. It simply turned at exactly the pace the water gave it day and night, whether anyone was watching or not. Your own breathing has become something like that wheel tonight, turning at exactly the pace it needs to, whether you're watching it closely or not, needing nothing from you but the water that keeps arriving. But that is only one small part of the story. New Year celebrations in these villages stretched across several quiet days, marked less by loud festivity and more by careful, deliberate preparation. Houses swept thoroughly clean, old debts settled where possible, a sense of gently closing one chapter before opening the next. Special foods, prepared days in advance, were eaten slowly over the holiday, each dish carrying its own small wish folded into it, for long life, for good health, for a harvest that would be kinder than the last one. There was very little spectacle in it. Mostly, it was simply an agreed pause, an entire village exhaling together before beginning again. Tonight can be exactly that kind of pause for you too. Nothing needing to be accomplished, nothing needing to be swept or settled, just a quiet exhale before whatever comes next. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Village midwives held one of the most trusted roles in the entire community, called at any hour, in any weather, to guide a birth using knowledge passed down entirely through practice and observation, rather than any written text. They often knew every household's history intimately, having attended the births of parents, and now their children in turn, carrying an unbroken thread of memory that connected one generation to the next more directly than almost anyone else in the village. A midwife's calm, unhurried presence in a difficult moment was itself considered part of the medicine steadiness passed hand to hand, the same way warmth passes from one body to another in a cold room. Whatever steadiness got you safely through today, wherever it came from, it's allowed to simply rest alongside you now. Its work for today already finished. But that is only one small part of the story. Calligraphy, practiced patiently by lamplight, was considered less a decorative skill than a way of steadying the whole self, posture upright, breath even, ink ground slowly by hand before a single stroke was ever made. A single character might be practiced dozens of times in an evening, not out of dissatisfaction with earlier attempts, but simply because the repetition itself was the point. Each stroke slightly different, slightly calmer than the one before it. By the end of a long practice session, it was said, the mind had usually grown as still as the ink drying quietly on the page. You don't need a single perfect stroke tonight either. Just the quiet repetition of breathing, slightly calmer each time, is more than enough to still whatever's left of today. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Even the storm itself, feared as it was, had its own quiet purpose that villagers understood without needing to be told twice. It refilled the wells, swelled the rivers that fed the rice paddies, and washed the dust of a long dry season from every roof and leaf and stone. A village that went too long without a storm grew anxious in its own way, watching cracked earth and shrinking streams with far more worry than any single night of thunder ever caused. What arrived tonight over the rooftops, however loud, was not an intrusion. It was simply the sky doing the necessary, patient work of returning what the season had slowly used up. Whatever heaviness settled over you today, however it arrived, may be doing something similar right now. Simply returning something you'd slowly used up, quietly refilling what tomorrow will need. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Village schools, called terracotta, often met in the corner of a temple, where children learned to read and write using a brush and ink rather than any pencil, tracing characters again and again until the motion lived in the hand as much as the mind. Lessons were rarely rigid or formal by later standards. A teacher might have students of very different ages working side by side, each moving at their own pace, the older children sometimes quietly helping the younger ones without being asked. There was no single grade to pass, no single moment declared as finished. Learning simply continued, unhurried, for as long as it needed to. There's no pace you need to keep tonight either. Whatever needs to settle in you can settle exactly as slowly as it wants to, with nobody waiting for you to finish. But that is only one small part of the story. Wide, conical hats woven from sedge grass, called sujagasa, were worn by nearly everyone working the fields, shielding faces from sun in summer and rain in every other season. They were light enough to wear all day without strain, and their woven texture let a faint breeze pass through, even while keeping direct sun and rain at bay. A small, clever compromise between shelter and comfort. From a distance, a line of farmers bent over rice seedlings, all wearing these same pale, wide hats, could look almost like a field of its own strange, slow-moving flowers. Whatever is shielding you right now, a blanket, a dim room, simple closed eyes, is doing the same quiet, clever work, letting just enough of the world in while keeping the rest gently out. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In certain villages, ripe persimmons were peeled and hung in long orange rows along the eaves of houses each autumn, left to dry slowly in the cool air over several weeks, until they became something closer to a soft, chewy sweet. The hanging fruit needed almost no attention once strung, just time and the particular dry, cool wind of that season, doing all the necessary work on its own. Neighbors would sometimes compare whose persimmons had dried the most evenly, a small, good-natured pride taken in a process that required patience far more than skill. Whatever is happening in you right now needs almost no attention either. Just time and the particular quiet of this hour, doing all the necessary work entirely on its own. But that is only one small part of the story. Village kilns, often shared among several households, fired simple pottery bowls, jars for pickling vegetables, jugs for storing water or oil, in batches that might only happen 2 or 3 times a year. Firing a kiln properly took an entire day and night of careful attention. Someone always awake to feed the fire at exactly the right pace, since too much heat too quickly could crack everything inside beyond saving. Whoever kept watch through those long nights grew to recognize the fire's particular moods by sound and color alone, adjusting almost without thinking. There's no fire that needs tending in you tonight. Whatever shape you're settling into right now is already exactly the shape it needs to be, with nothing left to adjust. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Some villages kept simple hives, tending bees in hollow logs, or woven baskets set along a sunny wall, harvesting honey only once or twice a year in careful, smoke-calmed sessions. The bees themselves were left mostly alone the rest of the time, trusted to do their own patient work among the surrounding wildflowers and orchard blossoms, without any real supervision at all. A good year's honey, dark and thick, might sweeten an entire household's tea and medicine alike, until the following harvest came around again. Something in you has likely been quietly working today too, mostly unsupervised, gathering up small pieces of a long day the same patient way. And tonight, finally, it gets to rest from that gathering. But that is only one small part of the story. Rice planting songs, called Tayuda, were sung by rows of workers bent over flooded paddies each spring. The rhythm of the song matching the rhythm of their hands, setting one seedling after another into the mud. Nobody needed to lead these songs formally. They simply rose up from whoever felt like starting, picked up by the row nearest them, carried down the line, until the whole field seemed to be humming the same slow, repetitive tune. The words mattered less than the steady beat underneath them, a beat that made hours of bent-backed labor feel, if only slightly, lighter to carry. Let whatever rhythm is underneath, your own breathing right, now carry you the same way, no words required. Just a steady beat, making the last of today feel a little lighter to set down. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Hand looms, kept in a spare room of many farming households, produced the coarser, everyday cloth a family needed. The shuttle passed back and forth with a steady clack that could run for hours during the quiet months after harvest. Weaving was often done by firelight in the evening, one thread laid carefully over another. Hundreds of passes required for even a modest length of fabric, the whole cloth emerging so gradually that progress was nearly invisible from one evening to the next. And yet, cloth was always finished eventually. It simply required continuing. Whatever rest you're moving toward tonight is arriving the very same way, nearly invisible from one breath to the next, and yet, somehow, always eventually finished. But that is only one small part of the story. Stone lanterns, called toro, stood at the edges of garden paths and near shrine entrances, their small openings designed to hold a single candle or oil flame that cast soft, patterned light onto the ground just ahead of a walker's feet. They weren't meant to light an entire space, only the next few steps, which was usually all a traveler really needed on a familiar path after dark. Moss would often grow slowly across their stone surfaces over the years, softening their edges further, until the lantern seemed to belong to the garden as much as the garden belonged to it. You don't need to see the whole night ahead of you right now either. Just enough light for the next few steps toward sleep is more than enough. And it's already right there, waiting. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Small woven charms called amamari, obtained from a local shrine or temple, were carried quietly in a sleeve or tucked into a home's doorway. Each one believed to offer a particular kind of protection, safe travel, good health, and easy childbirth. Nobody expected a charm to do the work alone. It was more a small, physical reminder to walk carefully, rest properly, take the necessary precautions the charm was meant to represent. Over months of handling, the woven fabric would soften and fade slightly, evidence of how often it had been quietly touched for reassurance. Whatever small reassurance you need right now doesn't need to come from anywhere special either. Simply noticing that you are warm and safe and still can do quietly the same work. But that is only one small part of the story. During the autumn harvest festival, called Matsuri, taiko drums were carried out and played in the open square, their deep, rolling beat said to travel far enough to reach neighboring villages on a still night. Drummers rotated through long stretches of playing, the rhythm never quite stopping for hours at a time, building and easing in waves that seemed to match the whole village's collective relief at a harvest finally gathered in. Afterward, the drums were wrapped carefully and stored away, silent again until the next year's festival called for them. There's no drum that needs playing in you tonight. Whatever effort carried you through today's harvest, so to speak, is done now and can be wrapped away just as quietly until it's needed again. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In the snowier mountain regions, some villages built houses with extraordinarily steep, thickly thatched roofs, called gasshosyukuri, shaped almost like two hands pressed together in prayer. Specifically, so heavy snow would slide off rather than collapse the structure beneath it. These houses could stand for well over a century, their steep angles quietly solving a problem that flatter roofs elsewhere never had to face. Each one a direct, practical answer to a very specific kind of storm. Families living beneath them slept soundly through blizzards that would have crushed a lesser design, trusting a shape refined by generations before them. Whatever shape you've settled into right now, however it looks from the outside, has likely been refined the same patient way, quietly solving, without needing praise for it, exactly the problem it needed to solve. But that is only one small part of the story. Baskets woven from split bamboo or willow served as the everyday carrying containers for nearly everything in the village. Vegetables from the field, laundry to the stream, fish from the traps at dawn. A skilled weaver could produce a sturdy, tightly woven basket in a single sitting, the repetitive over-under motion of the strips becoming almost automatic after enough practice, hands moving faster than conscious thought could keep up with. These baskets, mended rather than replaced when they wore thin, might serve a household for decades before finally being retired. Whatever has carried you safely through today, however unremarkable it seemed at the time, has likely done its own quiet, over-under work far longer than you've given it credit for. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. When someone in the village died, a simple funeral was held with incense burning steadily near the body. Its slow, curling smoke thought to help guide the spirit gently onward, rather than leaving it caught between one place and another. Neighbors brought small dishes of food, sat together in quiet company through the night, sharing memories in low voices rather than loud grief. A communal steadiness offered to the family left behind. It was never treated as something to rush through. Grief, like everything else in the village's rhythm, was simply given the time it needed. Whatever needs its own time in you tonight, whatever quiet feeling has been sitting unremarked in the back of your day, can be given exactly that same patience, no rush, no requirement to resolve anything before morning. But that is only one small part of the story. Silk cocoons, once the silkworms inside had finished spinning, were carefully unreeled rather than cut open. The single continuous thread of each cocoon, sometimes stretching over half a mile, if drawn out in one unbroken length. Skilled hands worked several cocoons at once, guiding threads together into a single stronger strand while keeping the delicate fiber from snapping, a task requiring more patience than strength. It seems almost impossible that something so small could unspool into something so long, and yet, thread by careful thread, it always did. Whatever tightness has been coiled up in you all day can unspool the exact same way tonight. Slowly, in one long, unbroken thread, for as long as it needs to. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Small arched stone bridges, called takebashi, crossed garden ponds and quiet canals in some of the more prosperous villages, curved so steeply that crossing one on foot required a slow, deliberate step at the very top. Their reflection in still water below often completed a perfect circle, so that from the right angle, the bridge and its mirrored twin seemed to form one continuous, unbroken ring resting gently on the surface of the pond. Villagers crossing at dusk would sometimes pause right at the highest point, simply to look down at that quiet, doubled shape before continuing on. You're allowed to pause at your own highest point tonight too, right here, before continuing on into whatever rest is waiting just past it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. A wooden fire watchtower, taller than any surrounding roof, often stood near the village center. Someone assigned each night to climb its narrow ladder and simply watch the darkness for any hint of orange glow among the thatch. Fire spread quickly through roofs made of dried straw, so this watch was taken seriously, rotated among households so no single family bore the burden alone. Night after night, season after season. Most nights, nothing happened at all. The watcher simply sat with the wind and the dark and the sound of the village breathing quietly below. And that, in itself, was the entire point of the job. Nothing needs watching in you tonight either. You can let go of that quiet, constant vigilance completely, trusting that this particular night simply intends to pass by uneventfully, the way most nights always have. But that is only one small part of the story. Sliding paper screens, called shoji, divided the inside of a home into rooms that could be reconfigured within minutes. A wall in the morning becoming an open doorway by evening, simply by lifting the panel from its track. Sunlight passing through the thin paper filled a whole room with a soft, even glow rather than a single sharp beam. And the faint silhouettes of branches or passing birds outside would sometimes show through as gentle, moving shadows, like a slow shadow play nobody had staged on purpose. A house built this way could never truly stay the same shape for long. It simply reshaped itself, gently, as the day required. You're allowed to reshape yourself just as gently right now. However, the last of today's tension needs to shift until you finally settle into whatever shape rest happens to take. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Some villages near rivers practiced cormorant fishing, called yukai, where trained birds dove beneath torchlit water at night, catching fish that a fisherman would then gently coax from the bird's throat before it could fully swallow. It was a partnership built over years between a single fisherman and his birds. Trust developed slowly through repetition until the cormorants worked almost as an extension of the fisherman's own reach, diving and returning without needing to be told. The soft crackle of torchlight over dark water and the birds surfacing again and again became one of the more striking night sounds a riverside village knew. There's a partnership like that quietly happening in your own body right now, too. One part of you gently coaxing another toward rest. An old, practiced trust, needing no instruction to keep working. But that is only one small part of the story. Village healers sometimes practiced a gentle form of heat therapy called moxibustion, burning small amounts of dried mugwort near specific points on the skin to ease aches, chase off a chill, or simply help someone finally relax enough to sleep. The warmth spreads slowly and evenly, nothing sudden about it, often paired with quiet conversation while the treatment worked. The healer's steady presence doing nearly as much good as the herb itself. Patients often said the treatment's real gift wasn't the heat, but the permission it gave them to finally sit still for a while. You have that same permission right now to simply sit still or lie still, letting whatever gentle warmth surrounds you do the rest of the work without any hurry at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Casting a large temple bell was a rare event a village might witness only once in a generation, involving molten bronze poured into an enormous clay mold buried in the ground. The whole process, wrapped in careful ritual, meant to ensure the metal would settle without flaw. Afterward, the bell was left buried and cooling for days before finally being uncovered, and its very first ring, deep, uncertain, everyone straining to hear whether the tone had come out true, was remembered by whole villages for years afterward. A bell cast well might ring, essentially unchanged, for 500 years or more. Whatever true, steady tone your own breathing has settled into tonight took its own quiet cooling to arrive at. It doesn't need testing anymore. It's already settled exactly as it should. But that is only one small part of the story. Rain gutters, split from thick sections of bamboo and fitted end to end along the eaves, carried water away from thatched roofs during heavy storms, directing the runoff into barrels or straight into the garden below. The sound of rain traveling along these bamboo channels was distinct from rain falling anywhere else. A lighter, more resonant patter, almost musical, different enough that a person lying awake indoors could tell simply by the sound whether the rain outside had grown heavier or begun, finally, to ease. Listen, if you can, to whatever sound is easing around you right now, however faint. It may be telling you, in its own quiet way, that the heaviest part of today has already passed. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Children in the village made their own toys largely from scraps, straw dolls stitched loosely together, small pinwheels cut from stiff paper, simple tops carved from a spare bit of wood and spun by hand along a smoothed dirt path. None of these toys were meant to last particularly long, and none needed to a straw doll losing its shape after a season of play was simply replaced with a new one. the making of it almost as enjoyable as the playing. There was no pressure for anything to be permanent. Enjoyed thoroughly, then let go of easily, then made again. Whatever enjoyable, temporary thing carried you through a moment of today can be let go of just as easily now, with no pressure for any of it to have been permanent. But that is only one small part of the story. A finished sword, after leaving the smith, still required a separate specialist, entirely devoted to polishing. A process that could take longer than the forging itself, using a graduated series of stones to bring out the blade's particular pattern in the steel. The polisher worked almost entirely by feel and careful eye, adjusting pressure by fractions, sometimes spending a full day perfecting a single section no longer than a hand's width. It was slow, exacting work, done in near silence, the polisher's whole attention narrowed down to nothing but stone and steel, and the fine, patient motion between them. You don't need any exacting attention on yourself right now. Whatever polish tonight brings you can arrive on its own, slowly, in near silence, needing nothing sharp or careful from you at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Straw sandals, called waraji, were woven fresh every few days from twisted rice straw, since they wore through quickly on rough village paths, and simply weren't expected to last much longer than that. Travelers heading out on a long journey would often carry several spare pairs tied to their pack, weaving replacements by firelight if needed along the way. The skill so common that almost anyone, young or old, could produce a serviceable pair in under an hour. Nobody mourned a worn-out sandal. It had simply done its job exactly as long as it needed to. Whatever effort carried you through today doesn't need to last any longer than it already has either. It did its job. It's allowed to be finished now. But that is only one small part of the story. Paper umbrellas, called wagasa, were made much like the paper lanterns, stretched over a folding bamboo frame, and coated with a thin layer of oil to keep the rain from soaking through. Opened, they made a distinct, papery snap, and rain drumming against the oiled paper produced a soft, hollow patter quite different from rain hitting anything else. A small private sound shared only by whoever stood beneath it. Villagers caught in a sudden downpour, without one, would simply wait it out under the nearest eave, watching those lucky enough to carry one pass by beneath their own small, dry, drumming shelter. You have your own quiet shelter tonight too, wherever you're resting. Its own small private sound, keeping the rest of the world gently at a distance. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In some garden courtyards, a length of hollow bamboo called a kake was rigged to fill slowly with water from a small spring, tipping forward to empty itself with a sharp, hollow knock against a stone below before swinging back up to fill again. The rhythm was slow and irregular by design. Knock, long pause, knock again, originally meant to startle animals away from garden plants. But villagers came to find its unhurried, unpredictable clack strangely soothing rather than jarring. A small wooden heartbeat set into the quiet of a garden. Some households kept one running purely for the sound alone, long after any animal it might have startled had stopped visiting. There's no need to predict the next sound around you either tonight. Whatever gentle rhythm surrounds you, let it simply knock and pause and knock again, exactly as slowly as it wants to. But that is only one small part of the story. Large ceramic storage jars, sunk partway into the ground near many houses, were kept specifically to catch and hold rainwater during storms like tonight's, providing a steady household supply through the drier weeks that inevitably followed. Families judged how much water they'd need to draw from the well during the coming season simply by how full these jars stood the morning after a good storm. A quiet, practical kind of forecasting built entirely on trust in what the sky had just provided. Nobody worried much during a storm about the coming dry spell. Tonight's rain was already quietly taking care of it. Whatever tonight's rest provides you doesn't need worrying over either. It's already quietly filling something you'll need later, whether you notice it happening or not. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Clothing in these villages shifted with the seasons in careful, deliberate layers. Lighter, looser weaves in summer allowing air to move freely against the skin. Heavier padded layers added one at a time as autumn cooled toward winter. Nobody simply swapped one set of clothes for another all at once. The change happened gradually. A layer added here, a lining thickened there. The whole household adjusting almost without noticing, until one day, everyone was simply dressed for winter and could no longer quite remember when summer clothing had been put away. Comfort, it turned out, rarely arrived all at once. It accumulated, one small adjustment at a time. Whatever comfort is settling over you right now is probably arriving the very same gradual way, one small adjustment at a time, until, without quite noticing when it happened, you're simply, finally comfortable. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Broad woven fans, called uchua, hung near nearly every hearth and doorway, used not just to cool a warm afternoon, but to coax a stubborn fire back to life with a few steady, unhurried waves. Skilled hand knew exactly how much air a dying flame needed, too little, and the embers simply sat there, dim and unchanged, too much, and ash would scatter everywhere. So the motion was always slow, always measured, a small rhythm repeated until the flame caught again on its own and no longer needed any help at all. Whatever quiet effort brought you to this exact point of tiredness tonight has already done its measured work. The flame, so to speak, has caught. Nothing more needs waving toward it now. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Village roads themselves were rarely straight, curving instead to follow the natural contour of a hillside or the gentle bend of a stream. Since cutting a perfectly straight path would have meant fighting the land rather than simply moving with it, travelers walking these winding roads at dusk often lost sight of the village behind one curve, only to have it reappear closer than expected around the next. A small, repeated reassurance that the path was still leading somewhere, even when it briefly looked as though it wasn't. Nobody minded the curves. They simply meant the road was listening to the land instead of arguing with it. Whatever winding, indirect way tonight's rest is taking to reach you, it doesn't need to be a straight line either. It's still leading somewhere. It simply hasn't needed to argue with anything to get there. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Before any bell rang or any rooster crowed, the village's true first sound each morning was usually birdsong, rising gradually rather than all at once. One or two calls at a time, gathering slowly into a full, layered chorus. As the sky lightened from black to gray to pale gold, villagers who woke early enough came to recognize this gradual swell almost as a kind of gentle alarm with no sharp edge to it at all. Sound simply accumulating until sleep loosened on its own without ever needing to be broken. It was, in its own way, the exact opposite of what we're doing here tonight. The same soft gathering, only running in reverse. And that reverse gathering is exactly where we'll leave things now, sound and thought and effort all quietly withdrawing, one small piece at a time, the whole village and everything in it finally, fully allowed to rest. As the night in the village deepened and the storm finally arrived, most households had already gone still. Rain moved across the thatched roofs in long, steady waves, gathering in the gutters and streaming down in dark ropes past shuttered windows. Somewhere, a bamboo grove clattered and hushed by turns. The rice fields, flooded and dark, simply absorbed what fell, patient the way water always is. Nothing needed tending anymore. Nothing needed watching. You can let all of this soften now, the way the village itself softened once the last shutter slid closed. There's no need to hold onto any detail we've wandered through tonight. Not the wells, not the fireflies, not the sound of wooden sandals on stone. It can all blur gently at the edges, the way a room blurs just before sleep finally arrives. Let your breathing slow a little further. Let your body sink a little deeper into whatever is holding it. Let your shoulders, one more time, drop just slightly further than before. Above you, whether you can see it or not, the sky is doing exactly what it has always done, turning slowly, steadily, the way it turned over that quiet village long ago, the way it will keep turning long after tonight is finished. It doesn't need you to stay awake for it. It never has. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well and good night.